You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 329 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I have more news and analysis to break down on the now disproven Russiagate conspiracy theory. The big news comes in a tweet from Senator Rand Paul, so I'll break all that down. I want to update some of the terrible things that our Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is doing with North Korea and Iran, and some updates on what's going on in the Middle East. There's fighting and contention in Israel. The U.S. allies in Syria have declared victory over ISIS, and Yemen continues to be a humanitarian nightmare. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to somebody. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where the show is featured on the homepage alongside my daily news roundup, libertarianinstitute.org. Make sure if you like the show, you're subscribing to it somewhere. iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, BitChute. It should be just about up everywhere, and I do update current event stories on the show, so if you're subscribing and listening to most episodes, you're probably going to be getting the most out of the show. And last, and if you can, think about donating to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I know I'm behind a couple bonus shows, but I really do appreciate for those of you who take, time to help out with the financial stuff that, goes behind making a podcast. So here we go with the big news of the day. I think the most important thing comes from a tweet. Senator Rand Paul says a high-level source told him that it was John Brennan who advocated to put the Steele Dossier within the intelligence assessment that comes out late in the Obama administration. Right at the end, even before I start the show, I believe, but this is one of the main fuels to the Russiagate fire. Of course, it's falsely claimed that it was an assessment of all 17 intelligence agencies, when in reality it was just a handpicked analysts from 3 different agencies. And apparently John Brennan, who we all know is a liar and whose disastrous Syria policy causes a lot of problems that the U.S. is trying to handle today with the defeat of ISIS and the return of a, kind of Sunni insurgency in eastern Syria now. But putting the Steele Dossier in there, I think really helped to make it seem like the Steele Dossier was a lot more accurate than it was, widely accepted as fake at this time. Even, by the people who knew it. They knew they couldn't confirm any details. This is the P tape, Cohen's meetings in Prague, and all these other fake stories. And I'm sure there, are some true details within the Steele Dossier and the story surrounding it, but turns out nothing actually illegal happens, and every major, salacious story that they've talked about has turned out to be fake. And so by including this in there, really, like I said, as fuel to the Russiagate fire, if John Brennan is behind this, also with the understanding that he knew at the time this is a major lie to the American people and should really be a big kind of deal. And everybody who helped push the story should, come out and probably, apologize and at the very least clear up and say like, hey, this is what that person told me. But this is, that lie that person told us is a really big deal. Hopefully we'll get, more details to emerge from this story. Like I said, this just comes from a tweet from Rand Paul. But at this point, you would have to start, I think, looking at pressing charges. I mean, this is, false intelligence, and I'm sure there's several ways we find that this kind of thing is illegal. But if not, just, run the guy out of town, and hopefully nobody will ever, ask John Brennan's opinion again and laugh at him and all of his policies, including the one where he decided to train an armed Syrian jihadist. So we have some polls. I believe this was a Reuters poll, post Mueller report, and, coming back, no indictments, and then Barr's letter saying, no more indictments and no collusion or obstruction charges. 48% of Americans still believe in the, central Russiagate theory, which has been disproved, that Trump colluded with the Russians in order to steal the 2016 election. I mean, this is absolutely false. Now, I think there are some people that continue to hold on to this very murky idea that GRU agents and the Russian Internet Research Agency manipulated Americans into voting for Donald Trump by placing a few poorly written and not well placed in a political sense ads on Facebook. A lot of them are ended up published after the election anyways. And as Gareth Porter explains and breaks down in Consorption News, that these single small number of advertisements that were run by these alleged Russian people in order to conspire against the American election, if that was actually what was going on, were absolutely minuscule, like 0.000 something percent. And I don't know what it's going to take to convince people that, this Russiagate conspiracy theory is actually 100% bunk. But we're certainly not there yet. Now, this poll had to be taken within, a few hours or so of this news coming out. And so maybe people still haven't had the time to fully process it. I mean, this is, I'm sure, a pretty emotional event. A lot of people, and correctly so, have a lot of problems with Donald Trump and a lot of his rhetoric and speech. It's certainly never the way I would explain something. And, some of it I find more and more horrific. But at the end of the day, he won the 2016 election in part because Hillary Clinton lost it. Well, I think that's mostly it, is that Hillary Clinton lost that election. The other point I'll note from this poll was that 9% of people, I guess, had their mind changed because of this news. I mean, that number is far too small, but I guess it's a start. Some good analysis from two people, and I'll link to these in the show notes page. David Stockman writes about the Trump Tower meeting and how really this was an issue with the Magnitsky Act. I've talked about the Magnitsky Act on the past on the show, but just to briefly review, it allows the U.S. to punish people for crimes it believes got off with crimes in different areas of the world because of corruption or an inability for justice to be pursued. And so there's a lot of Russians, what they call oligarchs. I really don't know what makes a Russian oligarch, if there's a certain amount of money they use, but I think some of these people actually are on the rather poor side. But it basically allows the U.S. to sanction Russians and other people throughout the world without, any kind of trial or anything like that. And there's often, some dubious and political reasons that the Magnitsky Act ends up being used. Now, if they actually use the Magnitsky Act in moral ways, like sanctioning Mohammed bin Salman for plotting the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, maybe there's some sense where that's not like a terrible policy to me. I certainly, am not a big fan of sanctions. We'd rather have, more popular boycotts. That's why when it comes to BDS, the boycott and divestment is the part that I could get behind, whereas the sanctions I absolutely opposed to. I don't think we should sanction Israel. But like I said, I think it's often used for more political reasons, and, people who end up being sanctioned don't deserve it, and people who should don't end up getting sanctioned. And so it's not a global justice policy as it's portrayed to be. And there was some Russians advocating to repeal this. And as the, publicist who arranged the meeting with, the Trump boy admits, he puffed up the story. He pretended like he had more than he did because he wanted to, get this face-to-face meeting. And I guess was hoping, maybe that Donald Trump was as easily influenced, or I guess that his son was as easily influenced by the father. And just, you hope to sit down, talk to the guy in the room for you for a few minutes. And if he generally likes you and you sound like you present a good argument, maybe he'll just adopt your position. But going back to the analysis, I think one of the best articles I've read so far is short. So I would recommend this as a share one. And the reason why I focus so much about Russiagate on foreign policy focus, and it's not just because, this is a huge lie, and I think it's always bad to have a media that's so lying and so hysterical, but because it's really damaged, I think, the U.S. and Russia relationship, the potential for some kind of better U.S. and Russian relationship under, the Trump-Putin relationship versus the Putin-Obama or Medvedev-Obama relationship. So I thought there was some positives here, and I think Russiagate largely undermined this. Ted Galen Carpenter goes through and explains that, but if you look at things like Trump repealing or backing out of the INF treaty should have been a huge deal to the left. I mean, they are looking to roast this guy for anything, and this was 100% stupid and foolish move on the part of Donald Trump to withdraw from this treaty. And yet for that, he receives very little heat from the left. Tulsi Gabbard and a few others are the ones who stand up there, but generally people are just kind of silent on the issue. And then, rather than celebrating something like a Helsinki summit as a possibility, to reduce nuclear weapons, to have more arms reduction treaties, to work out problems like Syria and Ukraine in diplomatic fashion rather than in violent fashion that ends up with innocent people being killed on the ground in foreign countries. They absolutely condemned those kind of meetings to an hysterical degree of, Trump is going to like give away the United States to Russia or something insane like that. All right, so all that's linked in the show notes page. I'm sure I'm going to continue to talk about Russiagate, not just because I do feel, kind of vindicated on this one. I feel like I really was skeptical in the face of, not as much criticism as most of the journalists like Aaron Mate or Ray McGovern have faced. But, I have been out there and saying like from a long time that there's something that's not right here. And here's all these really smart people who are writing. And when I read their work, I understand how, this is all fake. All right. Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo, this guy, I really don't like him. And I think he's dangerous ideologically, especially towards Iran. And in fact, he's toying with this idea, which is something that Donald Trump may sign on to, because Donald Trump, I don't really think understands a lot of these things, which is to make the IRGC, which is the part of the Iranian military that I think is probably the most capable. I'm guessing that's widely understood, does most of the Iranian foreign intervention. And I believe is more answerable to or only answerable to the Ayatollah rather than the supreme leader, the more civilian Rouhani. Or excuse me, Rouhani would be the president and the Ayatollah would be the supreme leader. Now, the reason that this is such a big deal and so dangerous isn't necessarily because if the U.S. labels the IRGC as a terrorist group, something's going to change for the IRGC. I mean, the group is already heavily sanctioned, but there is the 2001 AUMF still floating around out there. And this has been widely interpreted to mean that anybody who's labeled a terrorist and Muslim is a target, a possible target for a U.S. war. So we've seen this, justified to fight in Yemen. I believe the war in Libya in 2016 was justified here. Some of the interventions going on in Somalia, Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, and these countries are all around Iran, Afghanistan, of course. So why not Iran as well? There's really no geographical limitation. If you're labeling them as a terrorist group, it would really seem to open them up to carrying out potential attacks against them. And, maybe that doesn't even come in the Trump administration. Maybe, that this happens and for the next 18 months or however much longer it gets closer to 2 years that Donald Trump has in office and, loses in 2020. Some, warhawk Democrat like a Joe Biden comes into power and decides, well, hell, I'm tired of the Iranians and maybe they can't get back within the, nuclear deal or something like that. And, we end up using the 2001 AUMF combined with Trump's, terrorist list categorization and the U.S., attached the IRGC. Of course, I can't really understand how the U.S. would label the IRGC as a terrorist group. In Syria, they're welcomed there by the government, in southern Lebanon as well. I don't really read reports of the IRGC acting as an insurgency or carrying out terrorist attacks, suicide bombings or so against the United States. Pompeo has also stated that the sanctions against North Korea would remain until full denuclearization. We have other Trump administration officials like John Bolton saying that complete denuclearization means, we feel certified that North Korea has given up enough of their nuclear program, even as far as it goes, civilian energy program, centrifuges, enrichment capabilities, I think no plutonium enrichment capabilities, and the ballistic missile program and the chemical and biological weapons programs. And that's complete denuclearization, which, is far beyond what I think most people think of, which would just be give up all the nukes. And of course, North Korea isn't going to nuclear cripple themselves like that. They're going to, I think, demand a more sensible diplomatic process, which would be, both sides take steps to show faith in the, overall goal at the end, which would be complete denuclearization and normalization of relations, at least with North Korea and the rest of the world, so they could trade and the, people are somewhat less poor, even though if they, continue to follow the very repressive Kim Jong-un regime, they're not going to get rich like the South Koreans. I read a story that said Kim Jong-un fully expected Donald Trump to offer some kind of step-by-step agreement in Hanoi, and that didn't come in, so that was a big deal. Disappointing to see. It seems that the North Koreans have some belief, from what I'm reading, that this isn't because it's necessarily the position of Donald Trump, but his influence from his advisors like Bolton and, in some sense, Pompeo too. Of course, this statement's disappointing because it comes just after Pompeo's statement, after Trump had, eased some sanctions that were going to be placed on North Korea by the Treasury Department. And so I thought maybe, this relationship between Kim and Trump is going to start to reestablish itself, and there's going to be some kind of, the leaders of the two countries like each other. So no matter how much these advisors try to undermine it, they're really not going to be able to, but they're still certainly going to continue to make that effort. And hopefully Kim Jong-un will be able to work with Donald Trump more. I know they've sent letters back and forth to try to bypass some of Donald Trump's worst advisors here. All right, so Middle East stuff. In Israel, we had a situation break out where Israel carried out an airstrike that hit a university. In response, about 150 students went out and protested and were confronted by some Israeli soldiers. They say rockets were thrown and firebombs. I didn't get a clear description on what a firebomb was. I'm guessing something like a Molotov cocktail. But the way they stretch the truth, it could be something like a firecracker too. In response, the IDF carried out some, tear gas attacks and fired rubber-coated steel bullets, hitting and injuring 3 people. Elsewhere in the West Bank, there were some protests that resulted in one Israeli soldier killing a Palestinian who apparently had on medic gear. Now, there's also reports coming out that there was at least one person, I don't necessarily know if it was the person that was shot and killed, that was in this medic's uniform and throwing some kind of rods at the Israeli soldiers. While there is some flare-up of violence in the West Bank, most of the action has been going on in Gaza, where there's been an exchange of rocket fire and bombings between Hamas and the Israelis, with mostly the Palestinian people losing. That's not to completely dismiss that there have been some Israeli civilians injured in this whole thing, but the big airstrikes and bombings are coming from Israel, not from Hamas. From the most recent stories I've read, the fighting has somewhat subsided since Tuesday night. They say that the leader of Hamas has emerged from his bunker, and Egypt is saying that they've mediated some kind of deal. Now, the big thing here is, and I mentioned this on the show a couple times in the past month, but it kind of snuck up on me here, is we're going to have the big anniversary of the start of the Great Return marches carried out by the people of Gaza starting March 30th of last year. That's going to, I believe, be this Saturday. They're celebrating the anniversary, and this is likely to bring major protests from the people of Gaza towards the wall of their prison, which, happens to be the border of Israel, or kind of what they say is that. And in the past, this has been met with a strong military response from Israel. And over the course of these protests that have occurred for the past year, but almost all the deaths occur in the first few months, 200 Palestinian protesters have been killed. So there's a real danger that something bad happens on Saturday. Of course, most of all my sympathies here are really for the Palestinians who are in a situation in Gaza where it's going to be uninhabitable by UN estimates in 2020. The situation there is absolutely dire. And even though, you could make these statements against Hamas, and Hamas has carried out their own kind of war crimes and atrocities, at this point, there's a collective punishment going on to 2 million people within Gaza. And, they need to be able to access the rest of the world. They need to be able to rebuild their structures that have been destroyed, to trade enough and be able to fish off the coast enough, and have enough stability and access to outside goods to really, start to employ people and give people a sense of life worth and meaning. I mean, they say like 50% of the people there are unemployed. It's an insane situation, and, something really needs to be done. And so hopefully the result of the protests coming up here are going to be that exposure for the Palestinian cause and a demand to lift really the blockade of this, small sliver of land that holds 2 million people, mostly refugees. With Syria, we have U.S. envoy to Syria, Jim Jeffries, saying that the U.S. is going to continue the fight against ISIS despite our allies declaring victory there. This is, of course, what I more or less expected to happen. I don't think the U.S. is going to be completely ending the fight against ISIS But, I think some of the important developments here haven't been seen yet, which is how are the Syrian Kurds going to react? Are they going to try to occupy and hold all this territory that's, mostly Sunni Arab dominated? And this would, be the prime ground for the Islamic State insurgency to exist, especially when we've already seen in the past week or two a couple attacks by ISIS carried out against the Syrian Kurds around Manbij and other areas of Syria. Patrick Coburn wrote a good article for the UNS Review, kind of on the status of ISIS now. Says, it's turning back into insurgency. They're not completely, defeated in the sense that they couldn't try to retake territory or they couldn't continue their insurgency for years to come. But my take all along has been, if we really want to help the people of Syria, I think the best way to secure territory from ISIS would be to allow the Syrian army to come in and kind of control and maintain that territory, and hopefully be able to, negotiate a deal that works well for our Kurdish allies and everything else on the way out. I listened to an interview today, Scott Horton and Theodore Postol, who has been, critical for me in helping to understand some of the chemical weapons attacks and allegations in Syria. Now, here's the thing that I pretty much just have to correct myself on, and that is I haven't been completely right on the allegations in Duma. It seems that, Theodore Postol and everybody still accept the, Robert Fisk narrative of what actually happened at the hospital, but there were cases of Syrians dying within structures in Duma. In one particular case, what Theodore Postol says is the most likely sequence of events is that a chlorine canister was dropped from a helicopter and it hit the top of a building with the valve side down. I guess this, caused the valve to open and for the canister to puncture, kind of, he describes it as a needle. So, with some of it on the outside and some of it on the inside, the roof of this structure. Chlorine begins to seep into the room, and then as people enter the room, they die because of the dense amount of chlorine. I, haven't seen any evidence that would dispute Postol's theory here. I'll be interested to see if anything, surfaces in the time to come. But this would definitely suggest that chlorine gas from the Assad army killed some people in Duma. Now, what Postol, I guess, contends here is that he believes this wasn't necessarily meant to kill civilians, but scare them. And this is kind of the question mark that I've had, and, others like Will Porter who have come on the show have asked about these chemical weapons attacks, which is, why would Assad carry out chemical weapons attack? Tactically, it doesn't seem like a good move. But Postol explains that chlorine gas actually really, it's not WMD. It's not the kind of gas that's going to kill a lot of people in most cases. What's going to happen is it's a visible cloud, it's a slow moving cloud, and it's very dense. So people could easily flee a chlorine gas attack. But if you're looking to move people out of a city and potentially even, without killing them, one of the ways you do is by scaring them out with weapons. Now, this doesn't justify what the Assad government has apparently done here. And it's an absolute horrific thing within itself. Now, I still don't believe that justifies the U.S. airstrikes in response. I still don't think it equates, Assad to being a uniquely terrible butcher that needs to be taken out by the United States. And that the United States, in other areas of Syria hasn't used weapons like depleted uranium or white phosphorus that is atrocious too. But, it does seem that, kind of when I looked at the Duma narrative, I forgot all about people who died in other areas of Duma and just kind of focused on what was happening at the hospital because, that's where the main allegations were coming from. But, this certainly does give some credibility to the people who claimed only a chlorine gas attack at Duma. Still no evidence whatsoever, a sarin or a WMD situation. I'll link to that, episode of the Scott Horton show because there's a lot of stuff in there too about Khan Sheikhoun and Ghouta. And, Postol pretty much says that the narrative that I put forward on the show, and, largely because some of the work that he's done has helped me to understand what likely happened in those alleged chemical weapons attacks still hold. In Afghanistan, there's some stories I just want to go through quickly. 5 civilians died in a raid carried out jointly by the U.S. and Afghan forces. The UN put out a report that said part of the reason civilian casualties are increasing in Afghanistan and we're at a record high in 2018 is because of an increase in U.S. airstrikes in the country. And then this one I find the most interesting. U.S. officials were supposed to have a meeting with the NATO envoy to Afghanistan and the Afghan National Security Advisor was in attendance, so the U.S. refused to attend the meeting. This is absolutely ridiculous. This is part of the Afghan government that the U.S. is, supposed to be backing and supporting in Afghanistan, and yet we won't even meet with them when their officials show up to the meeting. It just shows what a catastrophe the Afghan war has been. All right, last up on today's show, some stuff about Yemen. The first is that the Yemen War Powers Bill. Now, this thing has been confusing as hell for me procedurally to understand what's going on. And this is part of the problem with the whole U.S. system, right? Is that nobody actually understands it. That somebody who's reading the news all the time and who's really focused on the situation in Yemen can't figure what the hell is going on with the Yemen War Powers Bill, because the Senate parliamentarian has a whole bunch of say in how that goes, even though who even knows who that guy is. But the situation, I guess, is that bill was stripped of its privilege, and so the Senate voted on on a bill, and now the House will have to re-vote on it. The way that the Republicans ended up stripping the initial bill of its legislation is through a process called recommitted, and I guess they did that to the bill, and then were able to add like a statement onto the bill, and that was the condemnation of Ilhan Omar's comments as being anti-Semitic. And this is what they use to say that, a bill that Congress is passing to end a war doesn't count. One of the absolute laid out in the constitutional congressional powers is being undermined here in part by, the Congress and the Senate parliamentarian. And, it's a procedural trip by the Senate Republicans. Advocacy groups are out there telling the Democrats, hey, don't fall for this dirty trick. They have a majority in the House, so I would assume that they would be able to prevent this. A couple big stories in Yemen. 5 UK soldiers were apparently wounded in a mission in Yemen. And so, this is going to be a big deal, hopefully, in the UK as, their politicians and people ask questions like, what the hell are we doing fighting a war in Yemen? 7 people were killed, civilians, when a airstrike carried out by the Saudi coalition nearly missed a Save the Children hospital in Yemen. Save the Children is a big international organization, and I know they're, good at working with governments and everything to let them know the location of their facilities. It's absolutely inexcusable for Saudi Arabia to carry out an airstrike so close to one of these hospitals. Pretty much every airstrike they carry out in Yemen is inexcusable, but, this one particularly so. And last is, unfortunately to say, there's apparently a new outbreak of cholera going on in Yemen. Now, again, as with the last one in qualifying statement I always give when I talk about cholera numbers now, is apparently these international groups have kind of a policy of saying that anybody who comes in with the symptoms of cholera gets diagnosed with cholera, because whether it's cholera or a different viral or bacterial, or maybe bacterial would be different, but if it's anything similar to cholera, the treatment's the same, fluids and rest. And so they say that 110 suspected cases of cholera with 190 deaths confirmed. And so, the deaths numbers one I would focus on is way too high. It's unfortunate this is happening. Part of the outbreak is in the Hadeda province, which of course is, really under heavy Saudi bombing campaigns right now. And of course, so much of this could easily be prevented by ending the war that's unnecessary against the Houthis. Oh, and I guess I should mention that the show I did with Sherry Voluntary last week on Yemen, I hope I did a good job. You guys should let me know, talking about that war there. I break it all down. I probably about an hour long, I think. And you might enjoy that. So Sherry Voluntary, she's a good friend of mine. She's a great person, great libertarian, always solid shows. And I'll try to find the link to that and put that in the show notes page as well. All right, I hope everybody's enjoying it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, KYAAALE on Twitter, Libertarian Union on Facebook, immersionnews.com is my website, and then the Minds page is minds.com/immersionnews.